policing for profit.
And we will stand up to Brookside and we will fight with everything that we have to get that city shut down.
Drivers paint a picture of a rogue police force.
And the whole time he was talking to me, he had this rage in his face and his eyes.
Aggressive ticketing, harassment, violations of civil rights.
Those responsible for the illegal misconduct and police misconduct, let me state this, will be held accountable.
Fines and fees exploding for this tiny town.
This is a police department whose one and only job was to raise revenue.
Was money more important than public safety?
I got pulled over 5 times within 4 days.
Do the changes go far enough?
Our goal is to have a Brookside Police Department that treats everyone with dignity and respect.
Brookside in the spotlight.
We're just a Thai community.
But policing for profit stretches across the country. The real cost and the push for change. Good evening. 3 years after we first heard the complaints about Brookside's aggressive ticketing traps, many are still asking who will be held accountable for the pain and financial losses that drivers faced. Have changes gone far enough? Intimidation, shakedowns, harassment, too many accounts to dismiss as just disgruntled ticketed drivers. We begin with how the tiny town of Brookside grew to become the poster child for policing for profit.
She left her out here by herself, man. Yeah, it was abandoned right here. We're going to deal with this. What's your name? What's your name?
A young woman left stranded on the side of the road after Brookside police pulled her over.
Go ahead and step out of the vehicle for me, please.
Why do I have to step out of the vehicle?
You're failing to answer my questions. Go ahead and step out of the vehicle.
How do I fail to answer your questions? I don't have to answer your questions.
Put your hands behind your back. Okay. You don't have to make this hard, sir.
Oh my gosh.
Unsettling, terrifying encounters with police. ABC 3340 News first started getting complaints about Brookside officers in 2019. Drivers claiming police were patrolling outside jurisdiction, hitting them with an extreme left lane citation before the state's move over law was even in effect. Then tag lights out with the tickets piled on. Drivers allege when they complained, threats followed.
He said, well, the judge has issued 2 warrants for your arrest, and where do you work?
Which ABC 3340 reported to state and federal law enforcement. After our news stories, town officials would not return our calls or emails for information.
For years, employees were told they'd be fired if they talked to Cynthia.
Hundreds of drivers packed municipal court every month. So many, officers had to direct traffic.
Because I believed that there were a lot of people that were being judged unfairly and not being told of their rights.
All in a tiny town of 1,300 people with a single business, no main street or even a stoplight. It was a police force that grew from a single officer to 14. Chief Mike Jones transforming the department's look and mission. Blacked out vehicles, officers dressed in SWAT-like uniforms who wouldn't even sign their names to tickets. A tank and SWAT unit, even a canine named Cash. Although major crime here was virtually non-existent, on social media, Chief Jones painted his town as a drug-infested, crime-ridden community that needed his force's protection. And the money from what many called excessive, unjustified ticketing rolled in. The money accounting for 50% of the town's budget.
But a lot of small towns operate on that model.
Attorney Terrell McCants represents drivers who feel their rights were violated in Brookside. He says the police department's request for cash to get out of jail rather than going through a bail bondsman were a red flag.
If you give us the money, we let you go, which is highly unusual for municipalities. Yeah, give us $600, give us some cash, and you can go.
In 2022, an explosive report from AL.com blew the lid off the town's practices, and Brookside leadership could no longer ignore the complaints.
When I started the mayor position in November, it was clear that we needed to take steps in addressing the policing issues.
Chief Mike Jones resigned. The town appointed a new judge, at least for now. Patrols on I-22 stopped, and a new chief took over, promising change.
With strong rules and regulations, we hope and we pray with the help of our citizens
that we'll get it right this time.
A scathing state audit found the town's finances, record keeping, and evidence in disarray. And many other investigations were launched, those findings still not in. Anyone who gets a ticket gripes about the cost. Most of us just pay up and move on. But when we sat in on Brookside's municipal court 2 years ago and heard the fines and fees stacked on defendants in the thousands of dollars, it was alarming. How would those who are poor, have children just scraping by, afford to pay up? And how would the court records affect their lives?
I lost my job, and actually it was heartbreaking because I put my life into driving is something I love to do, and I'm moving up to be a CDL driver.
D'Angelo Ware was a driver for FedEx for 4 years. He told us he was pulled over while making a delivery on Brookside's small, winding roads. He recalled it was raining that day. Accused of speeding, reckless endangerment, impossible, Ware says, in the big truck.
I'm fighting, I'm not guilty.
Ware had to wait a year for his day in court.
I've come here like a handful of occasions, and it's always, we're gonna move your court date, and the officer can't come because he's out with COVID, and it really has been overwhelming.
Ware tells us FedEx had no choice but to fire him with the outstanding driving charges. Finally, when Brookside Court reopened with a new judge in late April, all but one minor violation, Ware says, dismissed.
I'm feeling good.
Similar stories repeated over and over. Aleem Daniels recalls he was helping friends move just passing through on I-22 when they got stopped.
Treated us horrible, just manners were horrible. We were arrested, car was towed. We had to walk from this courthouse when we got out about 7 miles to get our car back.
But under the new judge,
I had maybe 6, 7 other charges that were dismissed.
While he's glad to have it all behind him, it has cost him money, stress, lost opportunities to make a living.
When I go to apply for a job or something and they see that these charges are pending and stuff, they don't want to hire me for things like that. So it's definitely been a hassle and a huge burden on me.
Advocacy groups fight for change.
Brookside exists solely for the purpose of raising revenue for the town's officials and their cronies.
Lisa Foster with Fines and Fees Justice Center says traffic tickets should not be funding city budgets, adding this policing for profit can have devastating consequences in low-income communities like Brookside. When drivers can't pay, they lose their licenses, the ability to get to work, jobs lost.
It's a vicious cycle of poverty and punishment that very few people can escape. This is not an efficient way of raising revenue. It's not a fair way of raising revenue. And in fact, it's quite harmful both to the people who are preyed upon, but also to the community at large that's forced to bear the collateral consequences.
In addition to issuing a huge number of traffic tickets, drivers say Brookside officers had a habit of taking more than just their vehicles, cash and guns seized.
4 months. My arrest was on January 17th, so we've been waiting 4 months.
Jeremiah Reed finally got his gun back, one he says was legally purchased and registered. It was taken by an officer in January during a traffic stop. Reed accused of impeding traffic, something he disputes.
I was absolutely traumatized. I actually sought therapy because it was very intimidating for a police officer in body armor and full SWAT gear in an unmarked vehicle to pull me over.
He was taken to jail, his vehicle towed. With no paper trail, he worried the gun was lost or stolen. Now, even after a judge cleared the charges,
I'm scared to even carry a firearm to protect myself at this point.
3 young men with families, no history of trouble, yet they all became tangled up in a small-town court system that was very hard and expensive to break out of. For them and others, lingering stress and anxiety.
I'm sorry. I get upset about it. To be falsely accused like that, it hurt. I've never been in this position before.
Grandmother Sandra Harris got hit with 6 charges. Initially pulled over for casting her headlights, her car searched and towed. Then she says humiliation while inside the jail.
They told me if I did not take off my clothes and let her check me for drugs, that's an insult, that I was going to be charged with more charges.
The outrage over what happened in Brookside reached all the way to the Alabama State House. ABC 3340's Stephen Quinn spoke with one state lawmaker at the center of this story about the changes which have since been made and those she says still are needed.
For lawmakers who've seen it all, this was something new.
We were amazed. We were totally shocked by everything that has taken place.
Representative Wandala Gavan represents the people of Brookside. She was one of the first to start hearing the complaints and to seek answers from Brookside police.
When it got to the point where the police department, even after calls to say to them, hey, you all are violating a law. You're moving police jurisdictional boundaries. And a chief of police at the time would say back to us, no one told us that we couldn't do that. At that point, I'm saying to myself, no one told you? No one should have had to have told you. What's understood should not have to be spoken.
As the full scope of what happened became clear, so too did Gavan's mission. Make sure nothing like this happens again.
Was it difficult in convincing other lawmakers of the importance of what was happening there?
Believe it or not, this was one time that my colleagues, Republicans and Democrats, we were all appalled. And there was also a realization that this wasn't just happening in Brookside.
Lawmakers in 2022 passed a pair of bills into law in direct response to what happened in Brookside. The first, trying to take the profit out of this kind of policing. Brookside's tactics led to a 640% increase in the town's general fund, which meant it could go anywhere, including officers' salaries. Now, only 10% of a municipality's budget in Alabama can come from tickets.
You had hardworking citizens that their cars were taken from them, and not within a certain amount of time. They don't know what happened to their vehicles. As a result, they lost their jobs. Some folks lost their homes. I have never heard of anyone forfeiting their homes on a simple traffic violation. That's unheard of.
We now know some of these traffic stops happened outside Brookside's police jurisdiction. Signs marking jurisdictions were even moved. Now officers found doing either of those things are guilty of a Class A misdemeanor, which means up to a year in jail and a $6,000 fine.
I wonder, what was the reaction from law enforcement when you proposed this bill, and especially when it comes to having this enforcement and making this a crime?
Believe it or not, the calls that I received from law enforcement was so overwhelming. The calls that I received and what I heard from them was, we want you to get them. Because we want people and the citizens of this state and this area to know that there are good cops out there.
The law went into effect immediately. So far, there's no evidence of any Alabama officer being charged under the new law.
It made other areas put a watchful eye on what they were doing.
Gavan says she's not done. She's working to revise a bill for the next legislative session, which would put safeguards on fines for municipal courts to protect people from unfair judgments.
That's ridiculous.
I go back to when I think about this story, I think about those town hall meetings. People were angry and they were calling on you guys to do something. As a lawmaker, sometimes you guys are not the most popular in public.
We're not.
But there were bills that were passed in response to this. What was the reaction from the community? Did they feel like they got the answers from you guys in Montgomery as a result of this? You're down on the ground there in Brookside.
Let me just be honest with you. There are some citizens that are still very upset because they want indictments. They don't want anything short of an indictment for those individuals who harmed them.
Gavan says the state is investigating what happened in Brookside. She says she's also eager to see the findings from a town-appointed investigator, former Judge Ken Simon. Many of you may never have heard of Brookside before this ticketing scandal broke in the news. The tiny town is in North Jefferson County off I-22. We wanted to know more about the people who call Brookside home. Muriel Bailey gives us a glimpse into what it's like living in Brookside.
Brookside is a laid-back little town in north-central Jefferson County. It's a former mining town incorporated in 1898. The town is so small, the number of students attending nearby high schools outnumber the population.
We're just a tight community. I mean, you pretty much can walk anywhere, know everybody and stuff, and everyone's always real friendly.
23-year-old Bradley Spittle has lived in Brookside all his life. He says it's a town where everybody knows everybody.
So my grandmother, she worked at the four-way for as long as I can remember, and just everybody, my people know her and say, hey, you're Mildred's grandson, ain't you?
The name Brookside stems from the 5 Mile Creek that flows through the town. It's on the creek where you'll find 5 Mile Creek Canoe and Kayak Company, a place to walk trails, go canoeing, or swimming, activities that bring in travelers from nearby areas. There's also the ballpark, and it's clear faith is important to this community as there's a church on almost every corner.
And we have some beautiful places around here and all.
One of the busiest places for the town, the Dollar General.
It's in between us and Gardendale, and so it's kind of hard to get to Gardendale in a short period of time, so everybody kind of comes here.
Debbie Wolf has lived in Brookside for 15 years with her husband. She says it's a tight-knit community.
I've met a lot of great people, and this has been a great community for me.
The recent spotlight has left those who live in the community in a tight spot emotionally.
I hate to see it. Hopefully stuff will change for the better.
With new leadership within the police department and all issues on the table, Spittle hopes it makes a difference in the town he calls home.
I think it's a real good forward step.
Muriel Bailey, ABC 33 40 News.
The man at the center of the Brookside controversy, former police chief Mike Jones, now lives and works in Florida, according to court documents. Jones resigned from the Brookside Police Department earlier this year. Some state leaders have called on others to step down, but that has not happened.
Jones, are you guilty? Are you guilty?
This is Mike Jones leaving Covington County Court in May. He hadn't been seen publicly since his abrupt resignation from Brookside in January. Jones faces the charge of impersonating a peace officer. Police reports state in April he identified himself as the Brookside police chief as he tried to get out of a ticket. Recent court filings show the conditions of Jones' bond have changed to allow him to work outside the state of Alabama. Before taking over as Brookside's chief, Jones served as Helena's city council president, but stopped attending meetings and was eventually removed from office. Jones also owned a private security company, which ran into financial problems. Jones ran from our cameras when we tried to question him about debts owed to local vendors and mounting lawsuits. We questioned Brookside's late former mayor about Jones' past financial issues. Does that raise any red flags?
No, ma'am. The only thing I can tell you about Mike is he's certified, meets all the credentials, be a police officer, and he's doing a good job for us.
Now the job Jones did as chief, the focus of several state and local investigations. Why were officers handing out so many tickets, towing so many cars? A state audit critical of record keeping, how the cash was handled, and the evidence room characterized as chaotic.
Going forward, that's not the way it's going to be.
Veteran law enforcement officer Henry Irby was appointed interim chief. Irby and Mayor Mike Bryan promised change.
Those are horror stories, and I hope and pray they're not true. And nobody deserves that.
In published reports and news conferences, Bryan has denied knowing how the police department was operating and said then Chief Jones directly disobeyed his orders about patrols on I-22.
More officers, more patrol miles, more contacts, therefore more revenue. That's when I realized that something didn't quite add up at that point.
Bryan has declined multiple requests for a sit-down, in-depth interview over the past several months, but the town has made some visible changes. Now police vehicles are clearly marked. Those military-style armored vehicles were returned to the state, and an emphasis on reconnecting with the community to gain their trust. But questions remain: why are some officers, the focus of multiple citizen complaints, still on the force? Others ask why the city still employs municipal judge Jim Wooten, who oversaw cases at the center of the controversy. An interim judge is now in place to clear the docket.
I have no comment about any other client, and I have no comment about any pending matters with Brookside.
Prosecutor Mark Parnell, who oversaw the prosecution of those traffic cases, is also still on the town payroll.
I feel that the judge and prosecutors all involved, they knew what was going on.
According to court documents, the two were given raises as the number of tickets, fines, and fees escalated.
But I also want to guarantee you that those responsible for the illegal misconduct and police misconduct, let me state this, will be held accountable and responsible.
State Representative Wanda Lingavan early on called for the town to clean house. Brookside Court is now back in session, and while cameras are not allowed inside, we have set in on several hearings. The defendants and drivers we talked with seem satisfied leaving, with many having charges totally dropped or their tickets dismissed. Interim Judge Marcus Jones getting very high marks. The sheer number of cases, though, a fraction of what they were. In some cases, people even got refunds for their bonds. Today, there have been no criminal charges filed in connection with the Brookside ticket trap scandal. But a Jefferson County judge and the district attorney have thrown out a number of cases where a Brookside officer was the only witness. And there have been a number of civil lawsuits filed, including a federal class action lawsuit.
The Institute for Justice has combated these abuses across the nation, from Philadelphia, challenging Philadelphia's civil forfeiture system, to Chicago's vehicle impound system, to code enforcement abuses in Missouri and in Georgia.
The nonprofit adds Brookside, Alabama to that list, calling the tiny town notorious, a case study in what can go wrong when police prioritize profit over public safety and justice. Sam Gedge saying the Institute for Justice wants to make an example out of Brookside so others think twice.
Brookside is certainly noteworthy in how brazen their officers were when it came to shaking down people using every tool in the law enforcement kind of armament. But the broader principle, I think, has far broader application. Because you see these profit incentives at play in municipalities all over Alabama, all over the nation.
The federal lawsuit alleges 14th Amendment violations, trumping up criminal violations to maximize fines and fees, and the relentless towing of vehicles for bogus reasons. Brandon Jones, his wife, and 3 kids were pulled over on New Year's Eve. Jones says he was pulled for no reason as he drove through Brookside to get COVID medicine from a family member.
As I'm stepping out, I asked him again, what are you pulling me over for? My kids, my daughter's crying and stuff like that.
Jones says despite showing the officer his insurance papers, he was handcuffed. His family left on the side of the road and their vehicle towed.
I had to pay them $170 for them to even tell me where my car was.
Jones says he will never drive through Brookside again.
Just like that was my first time going that way, ever. My first trip ever. All I hope for is that we get justice.
This matters to people at a human level. As Brandon Jones put it, it's not just about the money. It's just about this lack of respect.
Others have similar claims. For Shakithia Grant and her daughter, it started with a bad tag light.
The police officer grabbed me, slammed me on the hood of the car, grabbed my phone out of my hand, threw it on my mom's windshield, shattered my phone.
The two were taken to jail, their vehicles towed.
Where I had to undress and be humiliated by being strip searched, and my daughter as well, by Brookside police. They then put me in a cell with a man.
2 years after they bonded out, the charges dismissed, but they're still out $2,000, and they missed her mother's 60th birthday party while they sat in jail.
I do not want this to happen to anybody else.
Brookside tows jumped from 50 in 2018 to 789 in 2020, according to court documents.
She left her out here by herself, man. It was abandoned right here. We're going to deal with this. What's your name? What's your name?
Vehicle owners have to pay a $175 release fee to Brookside in cash, according to several we spoke with.
It cost me $175 to get this piece of paper from Brookside. They would not take anything but cash.
Then only with that release paper can they get their vehicle from Jets Towing in Adamsville, where they pay another $175 to the company. In 2020, that would have added up to more than $138,000 for the city and an additional $138,000 for the tow company.
At this point, I don't know what's going on.
We tried to question the owner of Jets Towing earlier this year about his company's role in the controversial practices. A state examiner's report found Brookside did not comply with the state law when it awarded a no-bid contract to Jets.
This is just a monstrous state of affairs, and it's not just a question of unconstitutionality. It's a question of common decency.
We spoke with the attorney for Jets Towing. He says the rates charged were reasonable, and Wayne Jett was just doing his job, and he had no control over who was towed. Meanwhile, Birmingham defense attorney Bill Dawson, who represents many drivers who think they were unfairly towed, says there does need to be definitive answers from the state on these towing practices and what he calls outrageous fees. He says municipal courts are known as police courts because the police always win. We checked in with other towns and cities about whether they charge these so-called release fees when vehicles are towed. Several charge nothing. That includes Coleman, Pelham, and Bessemer. Glencoe got rid of its $50 fee when it changed police chiefs in 2021. Anniston has a $5 fee, Childersburg $25. On the other end, Adamsville charges $250 to be paid to the city, separate of the fees paid out to the tow company. And Kimberly has a $250 administrative fee under its Safe Streets ordinance. That's paid by unlicensed drivers when their vehicles are towed. Award-winning journalist and AL.com columnist John Archibald joins us now. He's done tremendous work to give this story a national platform. And John, thanks for being here. First of all, this all broke in January. Now it's kind of off the radar. What now?
Well, I think that what's now is, of course, everybody's waiting to see if any charges will ever be filed, and that's questionable. But as far as I'm concerned, I think that we need to look at the systems that created Brookside and that allowed them to abuse the authority in order to take advantage of people to build their own budgets.
We hear over and over there are many more Brooksides out there. Did the laws in the state legislature that were passed, do you think those went far enough?
Well, the primary law was limiting the amount of money a town can use in their budget to 10%, from fines and fees to 10%. And, it's certainly a good step and it moves in the right direction because Brookside at its peak, well, we don't even know its peak because they haven't done audits recently, but Brookside, the most we know is using fines and fees for 50% of their budget, which is outlandish by national standards. And so limiting that to 10% is a great step. The question is how many loopholes there are. Forfeitures are not included. Other means, driving schools, that sort of things are not necessarily included. So there will be ways to get around it. We'll just see how many.
And a lot of people, I think you can't really appreciate what goes on inside those little courtrooms. They're shut off from the media pretty much. Unless you're right there and can hear these stories. I remember one day we were in there for 4 hours. A single mother, $4,000 in fines for a petty drug offense. A gentleman who could not speak English. Supposedly they were informing him what he was pleading guilty to, but we very much doubted he even understood. And just the magnitude of these fines on people you knew could not pay. And then the judge saying, don't leave without paying something. Go call a family member. It was a threatening situation from us sitting in the audience for sure.
Right, and the more you look, the more disturbing it gets in terms of I think the initial response from the investigator hired by Brookside to look at this issue, Ken Simon, was pretty revealing because it acknowledged that Brookside was preying on the people who were least able to fight, whether they were minorities, people with past criminal offenses that made them feel they couldn't fight it, or people who simply didn't have the money to fight it were the ones who were being preyed on. And if they found one offense, they would find up to 11 or 12. It's the first time I've ever seen a case in which, somebody was found with a joint and was charged with possession of marijuana, possession of paraphernalia for the paper that wrapped it, possession of paraphernalia for the baggie it was in, possession of paraphernalia for the tray that might have been used to wrap marijuana, to sort marijuana. And, I mean, and it was clearly a money-making scheme that preyed on the people who were the least able to deal with it. And many of the crimes were not crimes. I mean, hundreds of people were pulled in for driving in the left lane before the road rage law went into effect. So in essence, stopped and pulled over, sometimes left on the side of the road based on a law that didn't exist.
Now, as you know, Mike Jones, most of the city officials wouldn't talk with us after our initial stories. You did sit down with Mike Jones.
I did.
And he was explaining how this all worked. We read your article, but kind of expand more on what you took away from him as a person and how he thought this was going to be allowed to go on.
Well, I mean, how long do I have? You know, it really kind of burst into my consciousness when I read the audits for the city of Brookside, essentially from 2018 to 2020, which indicated that there was a 640% increase in fines and fees in that time, coming to the point where it amounted to 50% of the budget. And my head sort of exploded at that because that's outlandish. And so I went out to talk to court. I mean, I tried to reach him for quite a while and he didn't respond, so I went out to court to talk to the people who were in the 100-foot long line waiting to get in to go to court on these charges. And he and the mayor came out and got me, and we went in and talked about it. And I think the thing that sticks out to me most of that is, I said, you know, a 640% increase in 2 years is an incredible amount. And he said, it should be more. It should be more. If we had more police and if we had more people on the streets, it would be more. And that was stunning to me. And the notion that the 50% figure, which is even more egregious, didn't faze him at all. So he was saying, this is good news, this is good news, this is good news. And if you ask me what I felt about it, that's a different matter, I guess, because I did not feel like I was being spoken to in a truthful way.
So again, big picture, is this going to get fixed? Will things really change?
That's a good question. I think that's very difficult because, as I said, so many of these departments rely on this for their very existence, and so that's hard to change. I have heard quite a few police chiefs and police officers say, we don't want to be another Brookside. So in that sense, there's a recognition that it can do great harm. And I think that what happened to that department, I mean, that virtually all the officers were gone. I mean, it was new chief, different policies. They sent back a lot of their military equipment. A lot of things changed, which is good. And it signals that this is the wrong way to run a police department. But as we know, without real attention, things drift back to the way they've been.
So how does a Brookside happen? The cries of injustice go on for so long unanswered. It's left many asking who polices the police. Here's Brenda LaDunn.
I'm about to drop dead from all this trauma. He had his hand on his gun as if he were going to shoot me. I love law enforcement. I don't have anything but good things. Never been afraid until I hit Brookside.
We've got to stop the bleeding. We've got to listen and take the time to listen to the people who have been wronged, who have suffered at the hands of the Brookside Police Department.
A town hall meeting.
Good afternoon.
Called for by State Representative Wandalyn Givan and Jefferson County Sheriff Mark Petway gave people dealing with the Brookside police during what they describe as a frightful traffic stop a chance to speak out earlier this year.
We don't want just resignations. We want people going to jail.
Well, listen, I appreciate all the comments. We appreciate
Typically, city leaders should answer to the people of their communities who elect them.
They answer to the voters in their communities. The people that elect them to serve.
I kept everything. I was not about to lose this battle.
But for those struggling with the fallout from traffic stops in Brookside, where do they turn? I asked League of Municipalities Counsel Lorelei Lean. She advises local cities on legal matters.
The chief law enforcement officer of the state is going to be the AG's office. Their job is to make sure that cities and towns are following the laws and the parameters of the laws.
Cynthia Gould sought out Alabama Attorney General Steve Marshall to see if that is happening with Brookside.
We've been following a lot in some of the other media. Brookside, the police department, can you make any type of comment on what's going on there? Is your office involved?
Yeah, we don't comment on any possible investigations.
Another place to complain would be the State Ethics Board.
If they're concerned about an ethics violation, I would send them to the Ethics Commission.
I asked Lorelei Lean if a high number of traffic fines would trigger a red flag at the state level. State law has required yearly audits since 2019.
They're the boots on the ground enforcing the speeding laws, right? So I don't think we can presume that there's something nefarious about that. It just may be a matter of volume. I mean, if they're not out there patrolling for speeders, then nobody is. And it may just be that they're on a major US highway and their volume's going to look different. So is it a red flag? Is it maybe worth looking at? It could possibly be something, an indication to look at that, but there may very well be reasons why it looks different or out of the normal.
I was not about to leave without a receipt.
But for those with stories of traumatizing stops, they are demanding accountability.
We, as a community, we got to stand up and we got to put an end to all of it.
ABC 3340 News has reached out to several key players in this story, but none of them have agreed to comment. We continue to monitor the status of investigations into Brookside. Judge Ken Simon, who was hired by Brookside to take an independent look at the police department, told us he is still working on his report. We have yet to see the town's financials for 2021. APOST, the body that oversees police officers, has yet to release the results of its investigation into whether police were following established procedures. While it is speculated the Attorney General and the FBI are also looking at Brookside, there is no official confirmation. And the federal court cases filed against Brookside may take years to wind through the court system. We will continue to update this story as each of those elements come to their conclusion. Make sure to follow that progress on ABC3340.com. And if you believe you're a victim of predatory ticketing in other communities, we want to hear from you. Email us at iteam@abc3340.com. I'm Cynthia Gould. Thank you for watching our Town Hall special, Beyond Policing for Profit.